They handed me paper plates at my own Thanksgiving table, while my china sat locked away in Robert's dining room. By Christmas, they were standing in line at the food bank, clutching government vouchers I had orchestrated with surgical precision. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Nancy Coleman, and at 68 years old, I learned that sometimes the greatest act of love is teaching people the true cost of disrespect. I had spent 42 years as a benefits coordinator for the state of Kentucky, navigating the labyrinth of government assistance programs, disability claims, and social services. I knew every loophole, every qualification requirement, and every way the system could work for you or against you. My job was helping people when they had nowhere else to turn. I never imagined I would use that knowledge to turn my own family's world upside down. Robert had been my pride and joy once. Born when I was 24 and fresh out of college, he grew up watching me build my career from the ground up. I remember him sitting at our kitchen table in our little house on Magnolia Street in Bowling Green, coloring in workbooks while I studied for my certification exams. He would ask me what all the papers meant, and I would explain in simple terms how the government helped people who needed food, housing, and medical care. "Mama helps people," he would tell his teachers proudly. Those were the days when I believed that kindness was inherited, passed down through generations like eye color or the shape of your hands. The change didn't happen overnight. It started small, the way rot always does, creeping in through tiny cracks until the whole foundation becomes unstable. Robert married Lisa when he was 28, and she came from what she called good stock. A family with money, connections, and opinions about people who worked in social services. At first, her comments were wrapped in sweet smiles and Southern charm. "Oh, Nancy, you work so hard helping all those people. Don't you ever get tired of dealing with, well, those situations?" Those situations. As if poverty were contagious, as if helping people navigate government assistance made me somehow less worthy of respect. Over the years, the comments became less subtle. Family gatherings became performances where Lisa would redirect conversations away from my work, changing the subject whenever I mentioned a case I was proud of, or a family I had helped get back on their feet. Robert, who had once been fascinated by my stories of helping people rebuild their lives, began to nod along with his wife's dismissive attitudes. "Mom, maybe it's time you considered retiring. You've done enough good deeds for one lifetime," he said during one particularly strained dinner at their new house in the affluent Riverside neighborhood. Their new house. That was where the real problem started. They had bought it 3 years ago, a sprawling colonial with white columns and a circular driveway, the kind of place Lisa had always dreamed of owning. The mortgage was substantial, as were the property taxes, the homeowners association fees, and the cost of maintaining the lifestyle that came with that address. But Robert's job at the insurance company was steady, and Lisa's part-time work at an upscale boutique brought in enough extra income to cover their expenses, as long as nothing went wrong. I had been living in my modest 3-bedroom ranch for over 30 years. I had paid off the mortgage years ago, and the house held decades of memories. Robert's first steps in the living room, birthday parties in the backyard, quiet evenings reading on the front porch. It wasn't grand, but it was mine. And it was filled with the comfortable accumulation of a life well lived. My china cabinet held the good dishes I had collected over the years, each piece chosen carefully and treasured. My kitchen was where I had cooked thousands of meals, where I had taught Robert how to make my grandmother's cornbread, where I had canned vegetables from my garden every summer. But Lisa had other plans for my future. The suggestions started, innocuously enough. "Nancy, this house is so big for just one person. Don't you think a nice apartment would be easier to maintain?" Then came the more direct approaches. "We've been looking at some lovely senior communities. You could make friends with people your own age." The implication was clear. I was too old, too isolated, too set in my ways to continue living independently. The real pressure began after I had a minor fall in my garden last spring. I had been planting tomatoes and lost my footing on the wet grass, scraping my knee and bruising my pride more than anything else. A neighbor saw me fall and called Robert, who arrived with Lisa in tow, both of them wearing expressions of grave concern that felt more theatrical than genuine. "Mom, this is exactly what we've been worried about," Robert said, helping me to my feet. "What if you had broken something? What if no one had seen you fall?" From that moment on, every phone call included questions about my safety, my health, my ability to manage on my own. Lisa began dropping by unannounced, letting herself in with the spare key Robert had insisted I give them, walking through my house like she was conducting an inspection. She would point out things that needed repair, rooms that seemed too cluttered, areas where I could improve my quality of life by simplifying. "You have so much stuff, Nancy," she would say, running her finger along my bookshelves. "Wouldn't it be freeing to just keep what you really need?" What I really needed, according to Lisa, was to move into a senior living facility about 20 minutes outside of town. She had taken the liberty of touring several options and had collected brochures with pictures of smiling elderly people playing bingo and doing water aerobics. "Look how happy everyone looks," she would say, spreading the glossy pamphlets across my kitchen table. "And you wouldn't have to worry about cooking or cleaning or maintaining this big old house." Robert supported her campaign with the enthusiasm of someone whose wife had made his opinions for him. "Mom, we just want what's best for you. We want you to be safe and taken care of." But I could see the calculation behind his concern. My house, modest as it was, sat on a large lot in a neighborhood that was slowly gentrifying. Property values were rising, and developers were starting to circle, making offers to longtime residents who were ready to cash out and move somewhere cheaper. My house wasn't just my home, it was an asset, and I wasn't naive enough to think that Robert and Lisa hadn't noticed. The manipulation became more sophisticated over the summer. Lisa started talking about family gatherings and holiday traditions, painting a picture of how much easier it would be if I lived closer to them, how we could spend more time together if I didn't have the burden of maintaining my own home. "Imagine not having to worry about cooking Thanksgiving dinner," she said one afternoon, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "You could just relax and enjoy being with family." But I had been cooking Thanksgiving dinner for 40 years. It was my tradition, my table, my opportunity to bring everyone together in the home where Robert had grown up. The thought of giving up that ritual felt like surrendering a piece of my identity. "I enjoy cooking," I told her firmly. "Thanksgiving. Dinner is something I look forward to all year." Lisa's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Of course you do, Nancy, but you're not getting any younger, and we wouldn't want you to overexert yourself." As autumn approached, the pressure intensified. Robert called more frequently, his voice filled with worry that sounded rehearsed. "Mom, we've been thinking, and we really think it would be best if you moved closer to us before winter sets in. You know how bad the roads can get, and what if something happens and we can't get to you?" Lisa started showing up with real estate agents, apologizing profusely for the misunderstanding when I refused to let them through the door. "I thought you had agreed to at least look at your options," she would say, her voice wounded and disappointed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The breaking point came in November, 3 weeks before Thanksgiving. I was working in my garden, pulling up the last of the summer vegetables and preparing the soil for winter, when Robert and Lisa arrived unannounced. They weren't alone. Behind them was a man in an expensive suit carrying a leather briefcase, and a woman with a clipboard and a measuring tape. "Mom, we brought some people to look at the house," Robert said, his voice bright with false cheer. "Just to get an idea of what we're working with." I stood up slowly, dirt still clinging to my gardening gloves, and stared at the group assembled in my driveway. "I never agreed to have my house evaluated," I said quietly. We know," Lisa said quickly, stepping forward with her hands raised in a gesture of appeasement. "We just thought it would be helpful to know what your options are. Information is power, right?" The real estate agent was already taking pictures of the exterior of my house, noting the mature trees, the size of the lot, the potential for development. The woman with the clipboard was measuring the driveway and making notes about the foundation and the roof. They moved around my property like they owned it, like I was already gone. "I want them to leave," I said, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. Robert looked embarrassed, but Lisa stepped forward again. "Nancy, we're just trying to help you understand your financial position. This house is worth more than you probably realize, and the money from selling it could fund a really comfortable retirement." I said I want them to leave. The real estate agent looked up from his phone where he had been taking notes. "Ma'am, we're just doing a preliminary assessment. It's not uncommon for families to explore their options before making major decisions. Get off my property." My voice was quiet, but there was something in my tone that made everyone stop what they were doing. The real estate agent and the woman with the clipboard exchanged glances, then began packing up their materials. "We'll be in touch," the agent said to Robert, handing him a business card. After they left, Robert and Lisa remained in my driveway, both of them looking like children who had been caught doing something they knew was wrong. "Mom, we're sorry," Robert said. "We should have asked first. We just thought—" "You thought you could make decisions about my life without consulting me?" I said, pulling off my gardening gloves and walking toward the house. "You thought you could treat me like I was already dead." "That's not fair," Lisa said, her voice rising. "We're trying to look out for you. We're trying to be responsible." I stopped at the bottom of the steps leading to my front porch and turned to face them. "If you want to be responsible, then respect my decisions. This is my house, my life, and my choice to make." "Fine," Lisa said, her mask of concern finally slipping to reveal the frustration underneath. "But don't expect us to drop everything and run over here every time you have a problem. Don't expect us to worry about you when you're too stubborn to accept help." I watched them drive away, their car disappearing around the corner, and I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't anger exactly, though anger was certainly part of it. It was clarity. I had spent 42 years helping people navigate systems designed to support them when they needed it most. I knew how to assess eligibility, how to document circumstances, how to build cases that would hold up under scrutiny. I had always used those skills to help people who were struggling, but I was beginning to realize that they could be applied in other ways as well. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and a legal pad, making notes about Robert and Lisa's financial situation. I knew more about their circumstances than they probably realized. Over the years, they had shared details about their mortgage, their car payments, their credit card debt, always in the context of explaining why they couldn't help me with various expenses or why they couldn't afford to visit more often. Lisa had mentioned her student loans, her medical bills from a minor surgery the previous year, the cost of maintaining their lifestyle in their expensive neighborhood. I wrote down everything I could remember, organizing the information the way I would for any case file: income, expenses, debt, assets. The picture that emerged was of a family living paycheck to paycheck, despite their comfortable appearance, stretched thin by the demands of maintaining a lifestyle they could barely afford. They weren't poor, but they were vulnerable. One unexpected expense away from serious financial trouble. As I worked, I felt the familiar rhythm of case management settling over me. This was what I did, what I had always done. I gathered information, identified patterns, and found solutions. The only difference was that this time, I wasn't trying to help someone qualify for assistance. I was trying to understand what it would take to make them need it. Thanksgiving was 2 weeks away, and I was going to host it exactly as I always had. In my house, at my table, with my china, and my cooking. If Robert and Lisa wanted to play games with me, they were about to. Learn that I had been playing a much more sophisticated game for far longer than they could imagine. I had spent my entire career helping people when they were at their most vulnerable, when they had nowhere else to turn. I knew what desperation looked like, how it felt to have your pride stripped away piece by piece until you were willing to accept help from strangers just to survive. Robert and Lisa had never experienced that kind of humiliation, that complete loss of control over their own circumstances, but they were about to. Thanksgiving morning arrived with the crisp bite of November air and the familiar anticipation I had felt every year for decades. I woke before sunrise, as was my tradition, and began the careful orchestration of preparing a meal for 12 people. The turkey had been brining overnight, my grandmother's secret recipe that included brown sugar, bay leaves, and a touch of bourbon. The dining room table was already set with my good china, the spode Christmas rose pattern I had been collecting. Since Robert was a child, each piece carefully chosen and lovingly maintained over the years. The house smelled like sage and butter, cinnamon and vanilla, all the scents that had defined this holiday for as long as I could remember. I had spent the previous evening preparing as much as I could in advance, peeling potatoes and storing them in cold water, chopping celery and onions for the stuffing, making my cranberry sauce from scratch with fresh berries from the farmer's market. This was my domain, my art, my contribution to the family's collective memory. Robert arrived first, around 10 in the morning, carrying a store-bought pumpkin pie and wearing the slightly uncomfortable expression of someone fulfilling an obligation rather than enjoying a celebration. "Smells good in here, Mom," he said, giving me a quick hug before retreating to the living room, where he immediately turned on the television. He had grown distant over the past few months, ever since the incident with the real estate agents, and our conversations had become stilted and careful, as if we were both walking around a landmine that might explode at any moment. Lisa arrived 30 minutes later, carrying a green bean casserole that I could tell had been assembled from a recipe on the back of a French's onions container. She was dressed in what I recognized as her visiting the elderly outfit, a conservative sweater and slacks that suggested she was performing charity work rather than joining family for dinner. "Nancy, you look tired," she said by way of greeting, her eyes scanning the kitchen with the critical assessment of someone looking for evidence of decline. "Are you sure you're up for all this cooking?" I smiled and continued basting the turkey, refusing to let her see how her comment had stung. "I'm doing just fine, Lisa. This is what I love about the holidays." "Well, you know we would have been happy to host this year. Our dining room is so much more spacious, and we have that beautiful new table that seats 14. She said this, while looking around my kitchen, which suddenly felt smaller and more outdated under her scrutiny. "But I suppose you wanted to do things the traditional way." The traditional way. As if my decades of hosting Thanksgiving were some quaint relic rather than a cherished family custom. I nodded and focused on the task at hand, checking the temperature of the turkey and calculating the timing for the side dishes. Lisa wandered around my kitchen, opening cabinets and drawers with the familiarity of someone who had taken inventory multiple times before. "You know, Nancy, I've been thinking about what you said last month, about wanting to maintain your independence." She paused by my china cabinet, running her finger along the edge of one of the crystal glasses. "And I really admire that, but I also think there's a difference between independence and isolation." I turned from the stove to face her, wiping my hands on my apron. "I'm not isolated, Lisa. I have friends. I have my work. I have my community. But you're retired now, and your friends are getting older too. What happens when you can't drive anymore? What happens when you can't manage all this?" She gestured around the kitchen, at the pot simmering on the stove, the mixing bowls stacked in the sink, the general controlled chaos of preparing a large meal. Before I could respond, the rest of the family began arriving. Robert's sister, Jennifer drove down from Louisville with her husband Mark and their 2 teenage children, Sarah and Michael. Jennifer had always been the peacemaker in our family, the one who smoothed over conflicts and tried to keep everyone happy. She hugged me tightly and complimented the smell of the turkey, then immediately began helping with the final preparations, falling into the familiar rhythm we had established over years of shared holidays. Lisa's parents, Harold and Diane, arrived shortly after, both of them impeccably dressed and carrying expensive wine that I knew they would critique if it wasn't served in the proper glasses. They had never quite approved of their daughter marrying Robert, whom they considered beneath their social station, and they had never bothered to hide their opinion that I was a bad influence on Lisa's aspirations for upward mobility. The dynamics in the room shifted as soon as Harold and Diane entered. Lisa's demeanor changed, becoming more animated and affected, her voice taking on the slightly artificial quality she used when she wanted to impress people. "Mother, doesn't Nancy's house look lovely? She's been working so hard to get everything ready." Diane surveyed my dining room with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to finding fault. "It's very charming," she said, the word charming delivered with just enough condescension to make it clear that she found my home quaint and outdated. "So cozy." Harold was more direct in his assessment. "Nancy, Lisa tells me you're thinking about downsizing. Smart move. This place is too much for someone your age to handle." I felt the familiar knot of frustration forming in my stomach, but I kept my voice level. "Actually, I'm not thinking about downsizing. I'm very happy here." "Oh, but surely—" "You can see the practical benefits," Diane interjected, settling herself in my living room as if she were holding court. "Think of all the money you're spending on maintenance, utilities, property taxes. You could invest that money and live much more comfortably." Lisa jumped in eagerly, seeing an opportunity to have her opinions validated by people she considered more sophisticated than me. That's exactly what we've been telling her. There are so many lovely retirement communities now, places where she could make friends with people her own age and not have to worry about all the responsibilities of home ownership. I excused myself to check on the turkey, needing a moment to compose myself before I said something I would regret. In the kitchen, Jennifer followed me, her expression concerned. "Mom, are you okay? You look upset." I smiled at her, grateful for her genuine concern. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just focused on getting dinner ready." She lowered her voice. "Lisa and her parents are being pretty pushy about the house thing. You know you don't have to make any decisions just because they think you should, right?" I squeezed her hand. "I know, honey, but thank you for saying that." As I carved the turkey and Jennifer helped me transfer the side dishes to serving bowls, I could hear the conversation in the dining room continuing along the same lines. Harold was holding forth on the real estate market, explaining to Robert how property values in my neighborhood were likely to peak in the next year or two. "If your mother is going to sell, now is the time to do it. Waiting too long could cost her thousands of dollars." Lisa was nodding enthusiastically, adding her own observations about the benefits of retirement communities. "And Nancy, you have to think about Robert and me too. We worry about you constantly. Every time there's bad weather, every time you don't answer the phone right away, we're terrified that something has happened." When we finally sat down to eat, the conversation continued to circle around my future, like vultures around carrion. I tried to redirect the discussion to other topics, asking about Jennifer's work, the children's school activities, Harold's golf game, but every attempt at normal conversation was eventually steered back to my supposed need for a lifestyle change. The breaking point came when I went to the kitchen to get the coffee and dessert. When I returned to the dining room, I found Lisa clearing the table, stacking my china plates with the careless efficiency of someone who saw them as obstacles rather than treasures. "Lisa, please let me do that," I said, reaching for the plates. "Oh, Nancy, you've done enough. You must be exhausted." She continued stacking, and I watched in horror as she carried my grandmother's china to the kitchen and began scraping the remains of the meal into the trash can. I followed her, my heart pounding. Lisa, those plates need to be hand-washed. They're very old and delicate. I know how to wash dishes, Nancy. But even as she said it, I could see that she was treating my precious china like everyday dinnerware, running it under hot water and scrubbing it with a sponge that was too abrasive for the delicate glaze. Please, just let me do it, I said, taking the plates from her hands. Lisa stepped back, her expression shifting from helpful to annoyed. You know what, Nancy? This is exactly what we're talking about. You're so attached to stuff that you can't even let people help you. These are just plates. Just plates. I stared at her, holding my grandmother's serving platter, the one that had been passed down through 3 generations of women in my family, the one that had held countless Thanksgiving turkeys and Christmas hams and birthday cakes. To Lisa, it was just a plate. To me, it was a connection to my history, my identity, my sense of continuity in a world that seemed determined to erase my past. These aren't just plates, I said quietly. They belonged to my grandmother and her mother before that. They're part of our family history. Lisa rolled her eyes. Nancy, you can't take it with you. At some point, you have to let go of things that are just weighing you down. I carefully dried the platter and placed it back in my china cabinet, my hands trembling slightly with the effort to maintain my composure. When I turned back to Lisa, she was watching me with a mixture of pity and frustration. You know what? She said, her voice taking on the tone of someone who had reached the end of her patience. I think we need to have a serious family discussion about your future. This attachment to material things, this inability to accept help, this stubbornness about making practical decisions, it's not healthy. She walked back to the dining room, leaving me alone in the kitchen with my thoughts and my grandmother's china. I could hear her talking to Robert, her voice low and urgent, the words intervention and for her own good floating through the air like smoke. When I rejoined the family for dessert, the atmosphere had changed completely. The casual conversation and gentle teasing that had characterized our earlier Thanksgivings was gone, replaced by something that felt more like a business meeting. Lisa was explaining to her parents how worried she and Robert were about my situation, how they had tried to be supportive but how I was being unreasonable about accepting help. Harold nodded sagely. Sometimes you have to make hard decisions for people who can't make them for themselves. It's part of being a responsible adult child. Diane chimed in with stories of friends who had been forced to move their elderly parents to assisted living facilities. It's always difficult at first, but eventually they realize it was for the best. The key is to present it as a positive change rather than a loss. I sat at the head of my own table, in my own home, listening. To my family discuss my future as if I weren't there. Jennifer looked uncomfortable, glancing at me with apologetic eyes, but she didn't speak up. Mark was focused on his phone, clearly wanting to be anywhere else. The teenagers had retreated to the living room, where they were playing video games and pointedly ignoring the adults. The thing is, Robert said, finally joining the conversation, Mom is just being stubborn. She knows we're right, but she's too proud to admit it. I'm sitting right here, I said, my voice cutting through the discussion like a knife. The Lav's table fell silent. Everyone turned to look at me, and I could see the surprise in their faces, as if they had forgotten I was capable of speaking for myself. I'm sitting right here, I repeated, and I can hear every word you're saying about me. You're talking about my life, my home, my future, as if I'm already dead. Lisa leaned forward, her expression softening into what she probably thought was a sympathetic smile. Nancy, we're just trying to help you see the big picture. We're trying to make sure you're taken care of. I am taken care of. I take care of myself. But for how long? Harold asked. What happens when you can't anymore? What happens when you fall down the stairs or forget to turn off the stove or can't remember to take your medication? I don't take medication, I said evenly. I've never fallen down the stairs, and I've been cooking for 40 years without burning down the house. Yet, Lisa said, you haven't done those things yet, but the statistics are clear. At your age, living alone becomes increasingly dangerous. At my age, I repeated the phrase, tasting the condescension in it. I'm 68 years old, not 98. I work out 3 times a week. I volunteer at the library. I manage my own finances. And I cook a Thanksgiving dinner for 12 people without breaking a sweat. But you're tired, Diane observed. Look at you. You're exhausted. From all this cooking and cleaning and entertaining, wouldn't it be nice to have someone else handle all of that? I looked around the table at the faces of my family, searching for any sign of understanding or support. Jennifer was staring at her plate, clearly uncomfortable, but unwilling to contradict her sister-in-law. Robert was nodding along with his in-laws, his expression suggesting that he had already made up his mind about what was best for me. The teenagers were still in the other room, probably grateful to be excluded from this conversation, and then Lisa stood up and began clearing the dessert plates. But instead of taking them to the kitchen, she walked to the sideboard where I kept my everyday dishes. She opened the cabinet and pulled out a stack of paper plates, the kind I used for casual outdoor barbecues or children's birthday parties. "You know what, Nancy?" she said, her voice bright with false cheer. "Next year, let's make this easier on everyone. We'll use paper plates, and you won't have to worry about washing. All this fancy china, it'll be so much simpler." She began transferring the leftover food to the paper plates, scraping my carefully prepared side dishes onto disposable dinnerware as if she were cleaning up after a church picnic. The symbolism was unmistakable. My traditions, my standards, my sense of ceremony and respect for the occasion, all of it was being reduced to something disposable and temporary. "Those are for outdoor parties," I said, watching her destroy the careful presentation I had spent hours perfecting. "Paper. Plates are paper plates," she replied, not looking up from her task. "Food tastes the same no matter what you eat it off of." I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor. "I think it's time for everyone to go home." The room fell silent again, but this time the silence was different. It was the silence of people who had pushed too far and knew it. "Mom," Robert said, his voice taking on the placating tone he used when he was trying to manage a difficult client. "We didn't mean to upset you. We're just trying to have an honest conversation about your future." "My future," I repeated. "My future in a place where I eat off paper plates and let other people make decisions about my life." "That's not what we're saying," Lisa protested, but her voice lacked conviction. I walked to the front door and opened it, letting the cold November air rush into the house. "I think it's time for everyone to go home," I repeated. One by one, they filed out of my house, gathering their coats and their leftovers and their wounded dignity. Robert lingered at the door, clearly wanting to say something that would repair the damage that had been done. "Mom, we love you. We just want what's best for you." I looked at him, this man who had once been my little boy, who had sat at this same table and listened to my stories and laughed at my jokes and made me feel like the most important person in his world. Now he was looking at me like I was a problem to be solved, an obstacle to be managed. "What's best for me," I said quietly, "is being treated with respect in my own home." After they left, I stood in my dining room, looking at the chaos they had left behind. Paper plates with congealing food, my good china abandoned in the kitchen, the careful order of my Thanksgiving dinner reduced to something that looked like the aftermath of a cafeteria food fight. I began cleaning up, not because I had to, but because I needed to restore some sense of dignity to my space. As I worked, I found myself thinking about the conversation I had overheard, the casual way they had discussed my future, the assumption that I was no longer capable of making my own decisions. They wanted to take away my house, my independence, my right to choose how I lived my life. They wanted to reduce me to someone who ate off paper plates and lived in a place where other people decided what was best for me. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had assumed that because I was older, I was also powerless. They had forgotten that I had spent my entire career learning how to navigate complex systems, how to find solutions for people who had nowhere else to turn, how to make the government work for people who needed help. I had helped hundreds of people qualify for food stamps, housing assistance, medical care, and disability benefits. I knew the income requirements, the asset limitations, the documentation needed to prove eligibility. I knew how to assess someone's financial situation and determine exactly what it would take to make them qualify for government assistance. And as I stood in my kitchen, washing my grandmother's china by hand and thinking about Lisa's paper plates, I realized that I had all the tools I needed to teach my family a lesson about respect, about humility, and about the difference between wanting help and needing it. By Christmas, they were going to learn what it felt like to be truly helpless. They were going to discover what it meant to have to swallow their pride and ask for help from strangers. They were going to find out exactly how food tastes when you're eating it off paper plates because you can't afford anything else. I had spent my career helping people who had fallen through the cracks of the system. Now I was going to help my family fall through those same cracks, and I was going to do it with the same professional precision I had always brought to my work. They thought I was just a stubborn old woman clinging to her possessions and her independence. They were about to learn that I was a woman who knew exactly how to make their comfortable life disappear, one carefully calculated move at a time. The Monday morning after Thanksgiving, I woke up with the kind of clarity that comes after a storm has passed, and the air has been cleared. I made my coffee in the familiar quiet of my kitchen, the same kitchen where Lisa had dismissed my grandmother's china as just plates 3 days earlier. But instead of dwelling on the humiliation, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: purpose. I had spent the weekend researching, not the kind of casual internet browsing that most people do, but the methodical, professional investigation that had defined my career for over 4 decades. I knew more about Robert and Lisa's financial situation than they probably remembered telling me, and what I didn't know, I could easily find out. The beauty of living in the digital age was that information left trails, and I knew exactly where to look for those trails. My first stop was the county assessor's website, where property records were publicly available. I pulled up Robert and Lisa's address and studied the details of their mortgage. They had purchased the house 3 years ago for $420,000, putting down only 5% and financing the rest through a conventional loan. Their monthly payment, including taxes and insurance, was approximately $2,800. For someone in Robert's income bracket, that was pushing the upper limits of what financial advisors would consider affordable. But the real revelation came when I cross-referenced their mortgage information with the local real estate market trends. Property values in their neighborhood had actually declined slightly over the past year, meaning they were likely underwater on their loan, owing more than the house was currently worth. This was valuable information, the kind of detail that could become leverage in the right circumstances. Next, I turned my attention to their employment situation. Robert worked for a mid-sized insurance company where he had been employed for 8 years. Through the state's online business registry, I was able to access information about his employer's financial health, and what I found was concerning. The company had been laying off employees sporadically over the past 2 years, and their revenue had declined by 15% since the previous year. Robert's job, which he and Lisa treated as a guaranteed source of income, was far less secure than they realized. Lisa's employment was even more precarious. She worked part-time at an upscale boutique, the kind of place that depended on discretionary spending from affluent customers. Retail jobs like hers were always vulnerable to economic downturns, changes in consumer spending habits, and seasonal fluctuations. Her income was supplemental rather than essential to their basic survival, but it was necessary for maintaining their current lifestyle. I spent Tuesday morning visiting the local library, where I had access to databases and resources that weren't available to the general public. Using my professional credentials, I was able to access credit reporting information and financial records that painted a detailed picture of Robert and Lisa's true financial position. What I discovered was a family living on the edge of disaster, propped up by credit cards, personal loans, and the kind of financial juggling that could collapse with the slightest pressure. They had 3 credit cards with balances totaling over $18,000. Lisa had student loans from her college years that she was still paying off, despite being in her 30s. They had a car loan for Lisa's SUV, a personal loan. They had taken out the previous year to pay for home renovations, and several smaller debts that suggested they regularly lived beyond their means. Their total monthly debt obligations, not including their mortgage, exceeded $1,200. The picture that emerged was of a couple who looked prosperous on the surface, but were actually drowning in debt. They had built their lifestyle on borrowed money and borrowed time, assuming that their income would continue to grow and that nothing would disrupt their carefully balanced financial ecosystem. It was exactly the kind of situation I had seen countless times in my professional career. Families who appeared stable until a single unexpected event sent them spiraling into poverty. But I wasn't planning to wait for an unexpected event. I was going to create one. My strategy began with Robert's employment. Through my contacts in the state benefits office, I had maintained relationships with people who worked in various government agencies, including the department that handled unemployment insurance claims and the office that investigated workers' compensation fraud. I had also kept in touch with former colleagues who had moved into private sector jobs, including several who now worked for insurance companies. I made a series of phone calls, casual conversations with old friends who were always happy to hear from me. I asked about their work, their families, their plans for the holidays, and in the course of these conversations, I mentioned that my son worked in the insurance industry, and I was concerned about the stability of his company given the recent market trends. Was there anything I should be worried about? Were there any red flags I should watch for? The information I gathered was sobering. Robert's company was indeed in financial trouble, more serious trouble than was publicly known. They were actively looking for ways to reduce their workforce, and they were particularly focused on eliminating positions that could be outsourced or automated. Robert's job, which involved processing claims and managing client relationships, was exactly the kind of position that companies were eager to eliminate in favor of digital solutions. Armed with this knowledge, I began the second phase of my plan. I had learned over the years that sometimes the best way to help people was to give them exactly what they thought they wanted. Robert and Lisa wanted me to make practical decisions about my future, to be responsible and realistic about my limitations. So I was going to be extremely practical and realistic, just not in the way they expected. I contacted my attorney, the same man who had handled my husband's estate and helped me with various legal matters over the years. I told him I wanted to update my will and make some changes to my financial arrangements. He was delighted to hear from me and immediately scheduled an appointment for the following week. But before that appointment, I had other preparations to make. I spent Wednesday morning at the social services office, not as a client, but as a former employee paying a visit to old colleagues. I brought homemade cookies and stayed for coffee, catching up on office gossip and changes in policies and procedures. In the course of our conversation, I mentioned that I was concerned about family members who might need assistance in the future, and I wanted to understand what resources would be available to them. My former supervisor, a woman named Margaret who had worked with me for over 20 years, was happy to walk me through the current eligibility requirements for various assistance programs. The income limits for food stamps, officially known as SNAP benefits, had increased slightly since my retirement, but the basic framework remained the same. A family of 2 could qualify for assistance if their monthly income fell below certain thresholds, and their assets were limited to specific amounts. The key, Margaret explained, was understanding how income was calculated and what assets were considered exempt. Primary residences were generally exempt, as were vehicles below a certain value, retirement accounts that weren't accessible without penalty, and various other categories of assets. But liquid assets, cash, savings accounts, and investment portfolios were all counted toward the eligibility limits. "The thing is," Margaret said, lowering her voice conspiratorially, "most people don't realize how quickly their circumstances can change. Someone can go from being middle class to needing assistance in a matter of months if they lose their job, or have a medical emergency." I nodded sympathetically. It must be hard for people who have never had to ask for help before. "Oh, it's devastating," she agreed, "especially for people who have always looked down on others who needed assistance. The shame is almost worse than the financial hardship." That evening, I sat in my living room with a notebook and began sketching out a timeline. I had approximately 4 weeks until Christmas, which meant I needed to work quickly but carefully. The goal wasn't just to cause Robert and Lisa financial hardship. It was to engineer a situation where they would be forced to apply for government assistance, to swallow their pride and ask for help from the same system they had always dismissed as being for other people. The first element of my plan involved Robert's job. I couldn't get him fired directly, but I could create circumstances that would make his termination more likely. Through my contacts in the insurance industry, I learned that Robert's company was particularly sensitive to any hint of ethical violations or conflicts of interest. They had recently implemented strict policies about employees' personal financial situations, especially regarding bankruptcy, foreclosure, or other signs of financial instability. I began documenting every public record I could find about Robert and Lisa's financial situation. Late mortgage payments, credit card defaults, liens, judgments, any legal action that might reflect poorly on Robert's fitness to work in the financial services industry. Most of this information was already in the public record, but it was scattered across different databases and agencies. I compiled it into a comprehensive report, the kind of background check that employers routinely conducted on their employees. The second element involved their housing situation. I had learned that Robert and Lisa were already struggling to make their mortgage payments, and they were behind on their property taxes. The county had sent them several notices about their delinquent taxes, and if they didn't catch up soon, their house could be subject to tax foreclosure proceedings. I made an anonymous call to the county tax assessor's office, expressing concern about a property in my neighborhood where the owners appeared to be in financial distress. I provided Robert and Lisa's address and asked whether the property taxes were current. The clerk confirmed that the property was indeed delinquent and that the owners had been sent multiple notices. "What happens if they don't pay?" I asked innocently. "Well, eventually the county can initiate foreclosure proceedings," the clerk explained. "But we try to work with people who are having temporary difficulties." "And is there any way to find out if they're trying to work out a payment plan?" "That information would be in the public record once any legal proceedings begin," she said. "You can check the court records online." The third element of my plan was the most delicate and required the most careful execution. I needed to ensure that when Robert and Lisa's financial situation collapsed, they would have no choice but to apply for government assistance. This meant eliminating their safety nets, the family members and friends they might turn to for help, the credit sources they might use to bridge temporary gaps in income. I began by reaching out to Lisa's parents, Harold and Diane. I called them under the pretense of thanking them for coming to Thanksgiving dinner and apologizing for the uncomfortable conversation about my living situation. They were gracious, if somewhat condescending, and seemed pleased that I was coming to my senses about the need to make changes in my life. In the course of our conversation, I mentioned that I was concerned about Robert and Lisa's financial situation. "I don't want to pry," I said carefully, "but I got the impression that they might be struggling a bit." Lisa mentioned something about their mortgage payment being higher than they expected. Diane was immediately interested. "We've been worried about that too," she confided. "They're living beyond their means, but Lisa won't listen to reason. She wants to maintain a certain lifestyle, and Robert just goes along with whatever she wants." "It's such a shame," I said sympathetically. Young people today don't seem to understand the importance of living within their means. Exactly. Harold chimed in from the background. We've tried to talk to them about budgeting and financial planning, but they think we're being old-fashioned. I let them vent their frustrations about their daughter's spending habits and their son-in-law's failure to take control of the family finances. By the end of the conversation, they had painted a picture of a couple who were irresponsible, stubborn, and unwilling to accept good advice. More importantly, they had made it clear that they were not willing to bail out their daughter if she got into serious financial trouble. We believe in tough love, Diane said firmly. Sometimes people need to learn lessons the hard way. My next call was to Jennifer, Robert's sister. I was more careful with her, since she had always been sympathetic to my situation and might be suspicious if I suddenly started asking questions about Robert's finances. Instead, I approached the conversation from the angle of family concern. I'm worried about Robert, I told her. He seemed very stressed at Thanksgiving, and I know he's been under a lot of pressure at work. Jennifer sighed. He is stressed. The insurance company has been laying people off, and he's worried about his job security. Plus, he and Lisa have been fighting about money. She wants to remodel the kitchen, and he thinks they can't afford it. That must be difficult for them, I said. I hope they're not taking on more debt. I think they are, Jennifer admitted. Lisa keeps talking about home equity loans and refinancing. She thinks the house is worth more than it actually is. What do you think they would do if Robert lost his job? I honestly don't know, Jennifer said. They don't have much in savings, and they're already stretched pretty thin. I suppose they'd have to sell the house and move somewhere cheaper. Would you be able to help them if they needed it? Jennifer was quiet for a moment. Mom, I'd want to help, but Mark and I have our own kids to think about. We're saving for Sarah's college tuition, and Michael needs orthodontic work. We can't afford to support another family. By the end of that week, I had a clear picture of Robert and Lisa's situation and the resources they would have available if their circumstances changed. They were financially overextended, professionally vulnerable, and socially isolated from the kind of family support that might have helped them weather a crisis. They had built their lives on the assumption that nothing would go wrong, and they had no backup plan for dealing with adversity. On Friday, I received a call from Robert. His voice was strained, and he got straight to the point without his usual small talk. Mom, I wanted to apologize for what happened at Thanksgiving, he said. Lisa and I talked about it, and we realize we may have been a little pushy about the house situation. I appreciate that, Robert. The thing is, we're still concerned about you living alone, especially during the winter months. We were wondering if you'd be open to having someone come in once or twice a week, just to help with housework and make sure you're okay. I could hear the calculation in his voice, the way he was framing this as a compromise rather than an admission of defeat. He was still trying to manage me, still trying to find a way to gradually erode my independence until I would be forced to accept their solution. That's very thoughtful, I said, but I'm managing just fine on my own. But Mom, what if something happens? What if you fall or get sick or… Robert, I interrupted gently, I understand that you're worried about me, but I need you to trust that I'm capable of making my own decisions about my life. There was a long pause. When he spoke again, his voice had a harder edge. Fine, but don't expect us to drop everything and run over there every time you need something. If you want to be independent, then be independent. That's exactly what I intend to do, I said. After he hung up, I sat in my kitchen and smiled. Robert had just given me permission to be independent, to make my own decisions, to handle my own problems without expecting help from family. He had no idea that he had just removed the last obstacle to my plan. That weekend, I made my final preparations. I updated my will, transferring the bulk of my estate to charitable organizations rather than leaving it to Robert. I set up a trust, fund for Jennifer's children, ensuring that they would have money for college regardless of what happened to their uncle. And I wrote a letter, explaining my decisions and the reasons behind them, to be opened only after my death. But the letter wasn't just about money. It was about respect, about dignity, about the way we treat the people we claim to love. It was about the difference between caring for someone and controlling them, between offering help and imposing solutions. I sealed the letter in an envelope and placed it in my safe deposit box, along with copies of all the documents I had prepared. Then I went home and began the final phase of my plan. On Monday morning, I made a phone call to Robert's employer. I identified myself as a concerned citizen and explained that I had information about one of their employees that might be relevant to his continued employment. I provided them with the comprehensive report I had compiled about Robert's financial situation, including his delinquent property taxes, his excessive debt load, and his family's history of financial irresponsibility. "I'm not trying to get anyone in trouble," I said carefully. "I just thought the company should be aware of the situation, especially given the nature of Mr. Coleman's job responsibilities." The human resources representative thanked me for the information and assured me that they would investigate the matter thoroughly. I knew that in the current economic climate, with the company already looking for reasons to reduce their workforce, this kind of information would be taken very seriously. By Wednesday, the investigation had begun. Robert called me that evening, his voice tight with panic. "Mom, something's happening at work. They're asking questions about my personal finances and I don't understand why." "Did you say something to someone?" "I don't know what you're talking about, Robert." "Someone called the company and gave them information about our mortgage and our taxes. The only people who would know those details are family members." "Robert, I have no idea what you're talking about. Why would I want to cause problems for you at work?" "I don't know, Mom, but if you did something, you need to fix it. I could lose my job over this." "I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding," I said calmly. "These things usually work themselves out." But I knew it wouldn't work itself out. I knew that Robert's company would discover exactly what I had discovered, that he was a financial liability, an employee whose personal problems could reflect poorly on the company's reputation. In the insurance industry, trust and stability were everything, and Robert had neither. The termination came the following Friday, just 2 weeks before Christmas. Robert called me that afternoon, his voice broken and desperate. "They fired me, Mom. They said my personal financial situation made me unsuitable for employment in the financial services industry. I don't understand how this happened." "I'm so sorry, Robert. What will you do now?" "I don't know. The job market is terrible, especially this close to the holidays. And with my employment record showing a termination for cause, it's going to be almost impossible to find another position." "What about Lisa's job?" "She got laid off yesterday. The boutique is cutting back for the winter, and she was one of the newest employees." I felt a moment of genuine sympathy for my son, remembering the little boy who used to come to me with his problems and trust me to make everything better. But then I remembered the paper plates, the condescending conversations, the way they had dismissed my independence and dignity as obstacles to their plans. "I'm sure you'll figure something out," I said. "You're both resourceful people. Mom, I hate to ask this, but we might need to borrow some money, just until we get back on our feet." "Oh, Robert, I wish I could help, but I'm on a fixed income. Now, I barely have enough to cover my own expenses." It wasn't true, of course. I had substantial savings and investments, more than enough to help them through their crisis. But I had spent my career learning that sometimes the kindest thing you could do for people was to let them experience the full consequences of their choices. "What are we going to do?" Robert asked, and for the first time in years he sounded like the child he had once been, scared and looking for someone to rescue him. "You'll figure it out," I said gently. "People are more resilient than they think." After I hung up, I sat in my living room and thought about the next phase of my plan. Robert and Lisa had approximately 2 weeks before their unemployment benefits. would run out, assuming they qualified for benefits at all, given the circumstances of Robert's termination. They had perhaps a month before their creditors would begin serious collection efforts, and they had until the end of January before the county would begin foreclosure proceedings on their house. It was going to be a very different kind of Christmas for my family this year. And for the first time since that humiliating Thanksgiving dinner, I was looking forward to the holidays. The week leading up to Christmas was when everything began to unravel for Robert and Lisa, and I watched it happen with the careful attention of someone monitoring a carefully orchestrated experiment. They had started the month as a family concerned about my independence and financial decisions. Now, with 10 days until Christmas, they were about to discover what true financial desperation felt like. Robert's unemployment claim was denied. I learned this from Jennifer, who called me on a Tuesday evening sounding worried and confused. "Mom, Robert's having trouble getting unemployment benefits. Something about the circumstances of his termination. Do you know anything about that?" I made appropriate sounds of concern and surprise. That seems strange. I thought everyone who lost their job was eligible for unemployment. Apparently not if you're fired for cause. And the company is claiming that Robert's personal financial problems made him unsuitable for his position. It's all very mysterious. What wasn't mysterious to me was how unemployment determinations worked. I had spent years helping clients navigate the system, and I knew that employers often contested claims when they wanted to avoid paying higher unemployment insurance premiums. Robert's company had documentation of his financial instability, information that I had helpfully provided to them, and they were using it to justify their refusal to pay benefits. "What are Robert and Lisa going to do?" I asked Jennifer. "I don't know. They're trying to find work, but it's a terrible time of year to be job hunting. Most companies aren't hiring until after the holidays." Lisa had been the first to swallow her pride and take whatever work she could find. I learned from my network of acquaintances that she had applied for a position at the local discount retailer, one of those big box stores that hired temporary workers for the holiday season. It was a significant step down from her previous job at the upscale boutique, both in terms of prestige and pay, but they were desperate for income. She lasted exactly 5 days. According to the gossip that filtered back to me through mutual acquaintances, Lisa had been unable to adjust to the demands of retail work during the busy holiday season. She had been assigned to the customer service desk, where she dealt with returns, exchanges, and complaints from harried shoppers. The work was physically demanding, emotionally draining, and required her to be on her feet for 8 hours a day while maintaining a cheerful demeanor with increasingly difficult customers. The breaking point came when a customer berated her over a return policy she had no power to change. Lisa, accustomed to being treated with deference in her previous job, had responded with what her supervisor called an attitude problem. She was terminated on the spot, just 3 days before Christmas Eve. Robert's job search was proving equally unsuccessful. The insurance industry was small and insular, and word had spread quickly about his termination. Companies were reluctant to hire someone who had been fired for financial irresponsibility, especially during a time when the industry was particularly sensitive to issues of trust and stability. He had managed to get a few interviews, but they all ended the same way: polite rejection letters citing concerns about his employment history. By December 20th, they were in full crisis mode. I knew this because Robert finally broke down and called me, his voice cracking with desperation and humiliation. "Mom, I need help. We're going to lose the house." "Oh no, Robert. What happened?" "We're 3 months behind on the mortgage, and the bank is starting foreclosure proceedings. They want us to catch up on all the back payments plus penalties, or they're going to put the house up for auction." "How much do you owe?" "Almost $9,000, and that doesn't include the property taxes we haven't paid." $9,000. It was a significant amount of money for someone with no income, but it wasn't an insurmountable sum for a family that had been living comfortably just a few months earlier. The problem was that Robert and Lisa had burned through their savings, trying to maintain their lifestyle after losing their jobs, and they had maxed out their credit cards buying Christmas presents and paying for basic expenses. "Have you talked to the bank about a payment plan?" I asked. "They want a lump sum payment or proof that we can resume regular payments immediately. We can't provide either one." "What about borrowing money from Lisa's parents?" There was a long pause. "They said no. They said we needed to learn to be more responsible with money." Harold and Diane's response was exactly what I had expected based on our conversation after Thanksgiving. They had been critical of their daughter's spending habits for years, and they saw this crisis as an opportunity to teach her a lesson about living within her means. It was a luxury of perspective that only people who had never experienced real financial hardship could afford. "What about selling the house?" I asked. "We tried, but we owe more than it's worth. Even if we could find a buyer, we'd still owe money to the bank after the sale." This was another consequence of their poor financial planning. They had bought their house at the peak of the market with minimal down payment, and the combination of declining property values and high mortgage payments had left them underwater on their loan. They were trapped in a house they couldn't afford and couldn't sell. "Robert, I wish I could help you, but—" "Mom, please. I know we haven't always been respectful to you. I know we've said things about your living situation that were out of line. But we're desperate. We don't know where else to turn." His plea was heartbreaking and infuriating at the same time. He was asking for my help after spending months treating me like I was incompetent to manage my own affairs. He wanted my financial assistance after dismissing my independence and trying to force me into assisted living. He was coming to me as a last resort, the same way people came to my office when they had exhausted all other options and needed government assistance to survive. "Robert, I understand you're scared, but I'm on a fixed income. I don't have $9,000 sitting around. What about your savings? What about the money from Dad's life insurance?" "That money is for my retirement and my long-term care. I can't risk my own financial security to solve your problems." It was the same logic he and Lisa had used when explaining why I needed to downsize and simplify my life. They had insisted that I needed to be practical and realistic about my financial limitations, that I couldn't afford to maintain my current lifestyle indefinitely. Now I was applying their own reasoning to their request for help. "But Mom, we could pay you back once we get jobs again." "When will that be? And what if you can't find work that pays enough to cover your expenses and repay a loan?" "I can't afford to lose that money." I could hear him crying on the other end of the line, and I felt a pang of genuine sorrow for the man who had once been my beloved son. But I also remembered the way he had stood in my driveway with real estate agents, planning to sell my house without my consent. I remembered the way he had nodded along when Lisa suggested I use paper plates instead of my good china. I remembered the way he had treated me like a burden rather than a person deserving of respect. "What are we going to do?" he asked. "You'll figure something out," I said, echoing the phrase I had heard so many times from families who wanted their elderly relatives to solve their own problems. People are more resourceful than they think. The foreclosure notice was posted on their door on December 22nd. I knew this because Jennifer called me in tears, having driven by their house and seen the official paperwork taped to their front entrance. "Mom, they're really going to lose the house, and right before Christmas. It's horrible." "It is horrible," I agreed. "But sometimes these things happen when people make poor financial decisions. That seems like a harsh thing to say about your own son." "Jennifer, I've spent my career working with families in crisis. The kindest thing you can do for people sometimes is to let them experience the consequences of their choices. That's how they learn to make better decisions in the future." "But what if they end up homeless?" "They won't end up homeless. There are programs to help people in their situation." Jennifer was quiet for a moment. "What kind of programs?" "Emergency housing assistance, food stamps, utility assistance. The government has safety nets for people who qualify. Do you think Robert and Lisa would qualify? I think they're about to find out. The eviction notice gave them 30 days to vacate the property, but Robert and Lisa didn't wait that long. On Christmas Eve morning, I watched from my kitchen window as a moving truck pulled up to their house. It wasn't a professional moving company, just a rental truck that Robert was driving himself, with Lisa and a few friends helping to load their belongings. They were moving to a small apartment in a less desirable part of town, the kind of place they would have looked down on just a few months earlier. The rent was $800 a month, which was all they could afford with no steady income and damaged credit. They had been forced to sell most of their furniture to raise money for the security deposit and first month's rent. I didn't go over to help or to say goodbye. I wasn't invited, and I wasn't sure I would have gone even if I had been. Instead, I watched from behind my curtains as they loaded box after box into the truck, their movements heavy with exhaustion and defeat. Lisa was crying openly as she carried items from the house she had been so proud of just a year earlier. Robert looked like he had aged a decade in the past month, his shoulders hunched and his face drawn with stress. They had gone from being a couple who worried about my ability to manage my own life to a family who couldn't manage their own basic needs. That evening, Christmas Eve, I received a text message from Robert. It was brief and formal, lacking any of the warmth that had once characterized our relationship. We're moved out. New address is 1247 Oak Street, Apt 4B. Phone number is the same. I texted back, I hope you'll be happy in your new place. He didn't respond. Christmas Day was quiet for me. I had received invitations to spend the holiday with church friends and neighbors, but I had politely declined. I wanted to be alone with my thoughts, to reflect on what had happened and what it meant for my relationship with my son. I cooked a small turkey breast for myself and made enough stuffing and cranberry sauce for several meals. I used my good china, the same dishes that Lisa had dismissed as unnecessary complications. I lit candles and played classical music and treated myself with the respect and dignity that my family had refused to show me. After dinner, I called the local social services office and left a voicemail for Margaret, my former supervisor. I told her that I had family members who might need assistance with food and utilities, and I asked her to send me information about the application process and eligibility requirements. I knew the information already, but I wanted to have current brochures and forms to pass along when the time came. On December 26th, the day after Christmas, Robert called me again. His voice was different this time, flatter and more resigned. Mom, we need help applying for food stamps. The words hung in the air between us like a confession. Robert, who had grown up listening to his mother help other families navigate the welfare system, was now asking for guidance in accessing those same services for his own family. I can help you with that, I said calmly. Do you have access to a computer and printer? We have my laptop, but we haven't set up internet service at the apartment yet. We can't afford it right now. You can use the computers at the library. They have internet access, and they can help you fill out the online application. Can you come with us? I don't understand all the requirements and documentation. It was a reasonable request, and one that I had fulfilled for hundreds of families over the years. But this time was different. This time, I was helping my own son apply for the same government assistance that he had once viewed as charity for other people. Of course, I said. When would you like to go? As soon as possible. We don't have much food in the apartment. And we spent what little money we had on rent and utilities. We made an appointment to meet at the library the following morning. After I hung up, I sat in my living room and thought about the full circle that our relationship had completed. 6 months ago, Robert had been concerned about my ability to manage my finances and make responsible decisions about my future. Now, he was asking me to help him navigate a system designed for people who had lost control of their own circumstances. I pulled out the folder of information Margaret had sent me and reviewed the eligibility requirements for SNAP benefits. Based on what I knew about Robert and Lisa's current situation, they would qualify for the maximum monthly benefit for a family of two, $347 in food assistance per month. It wasn't a lot of money, but it would be enough to ensure they didn't go hungry while they tried to rebuild their lives. They would have to shop carefully, buy generic brands, and prepare most of their meals at home. They would have to use their benefits at approved retailers and follow the program's restrictions on what types of food could be purchased. They would, in other words, have to learn to live within their means in a way they had never done before. They would have to experience the humility of using government assistance to meet their basic needs, the shame of pulling out an electronic benefits transfer card at the grocery store checkout, the reality of depending on the kindness of strangers, and the mercy of government bureaucrats. It was exactly the lesson I had hoped they would learn, delivered with the precision and thoroughness that had defined my entire career. They had wanted to teach me about practical decision-making and financial responsibility. Now I was going to teach them about consequences and humility and the difference between wanting help and needing it. Tomorrow, we would go to the social services office together, and I would help my son fill out forms that would officially classify his family as low income and in need of government assistance. I would watch him answer questions about his employment history, his assets, his monthly expenses, and his household composition. I would see him provide documentation of his financial desperation and his inability to provide for his family's basic needs. And then, if his application was approved, I would watch him receive his first electronic benefits transfer card, the plastic rectangle that would allow him to purchase food with taxpayer dollars. The same taxpayer dollars that had funded my salary for 42 years. The same system that I had administered with compassion and professionalism. The same safety net that I had helped weave for families just like his. It was going to be a very educational experience for all of us. The library was nearly empty on the morning of December 27th. Most people still recovering from Christmas celebrations or sleeping off holiday indulgence. I arrived early and chose a computer station, near the back, away from the main circulation area where we might be overheard. When Robert and Lisa walked in 20 minutes later, they looked like different people than the confident couple who had lectured me about financial responsibility just 2 months earlier. Robert's clothes were wrinkled and ill-fitting, clearly borrowed or purchased from a thrift store. Lisa had dark circles under her eyes and her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, a far cry from the carefully styled appearance she had maintained when she worked at the boutique. They moved through the library with the careful, subdued manner of people who were afraid of drawing attention to themselves. "Thank you for meeting us here, Mom," Robert said quietly as they sat down beside me. "I know this is awkward." "There's nothing awkward about needing help," I replied, opening the folder of documents I had brought. "This is what the system is designed for." I had printed out the SNAP application forms and gathered all the documentation they would need: proof of identity, social security cards, bank statements, termination letters from their employers, copies of their lease agreement, and utility bills. I had done this same process hundreds of times with other families, but never with my own son sitting beside me, his hands shaking as he tried to fill out the forms. "Current monthly income," I read from the application. "You'll need to list Lisa's final paycheck from the retail store and any unemployment benefits you might be receiving." "We're not getting unemployment," Robert said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The claim was denied." "Then you'll enter 0 for that category," I said matter-of-factly. "What about savings accounts or other assets?" Lisa laughed bitterly. "We have about $43 in our checking account. That's it." I helped them navigate each section of the application, explaining the requirements and ensuring they provided accurate information. When we reached the section about household expenses, the reality of their situation became even more stark. Their rent, utilities, and car insurance consumed nearly all of what little money they had managed to scrape together. leaving almost nothing for food, clothing, or other necessities. "How long does the approval process take?" Lisa asked as we submitted the electronic application. "Usually 7 to 10 business days," I explained. "But because you have no income and minimal assets, you should qualify for expedited processing. That means you could receive benefits within 3 days." 3 days, Robert repeated as if he couldn't quite believe it was possible. "You'll need to complete a phone interview with a caseworker," I continued. "They'll verify the information you provided and ask some additional questions about your circumstances. Be honest and straightforward. Don't try to minimize your situation or make it sound better than it is." After we finished the application, I drove them back to their apartment building. It was a 2-story complex that had seen better days, with peeling paint and a parking lot full of older cars. Their unit was on the 2nd floor, accessible only by an exterior staircase that creaked ominously under our weight. The apartment itself was smaller than I had expected, maybe 600 square feet total. The living room and kitchen were combined into one space, with a small bedroom and bathroom down a short hallway. Their furniture consisted of a few pieces they had managed to keep from their house: a couch, a kitchen table with 2 chairs, and a television sitting on a cardboard box. "It's not much," Lisa said, noticing me looking around the sparse space. "But it's what we can afford right now." "It's clean and safe," I said. "That's what matters." The refrigerator was nearly empty except for some condiments, a few eggs, and half a loaf of bread. The pantry contained a box of crackers, a can of soup, and some instant oatmeal. They had been living on whatever they could afford with their remaining cash, stretching each dollar as far as possible. "Once your benefits are approved, you'll receive an electronic benefits transfer card," I explained. "It works like a debit card, but it can only be used for eligible food items at approved retailers." "What kinds of food can we buy?" Robert asked. "Most grocery items except prepared foods, alcohol, and non-food items. You can't use it at restaurants, but you can buy ingredients to cook meals at home." I spent the next hour teaching them how to shop efficiently with food stamps, sharing strategies I had learned from clients over the years. Buy generic brands, shop sales, use coupons when possible. Focus on nutritious foods that would stretch their benefits through the entire month. It was a conversation I had never imagined having with my son, but one that he desperately needed to hear. 2 days later, Robert called to tell me their application had been approved. They would receive $294 in monthly SNAP benefits, enough to cover basic groceries if they shopped carefully and prepared most of their meals at home. "We got the card in the mail today," he said, his voice a mixture of relief and humiliation. "We're going to the store this afternoon." "Do you want me to come with you the first time?" I offered. Using the card can be intimidating initially. "Would you? I mean, if you don't mind." I met them at the grocery store, the same chain where Lisa had once shopped for organic produce and expensive cuts of meat. Now they were in the discount aisle, carefully comparing prices and calculating how to make their benefits last the entire month. I watched Robert study a package of ground beef, checking the price per pound and the expiration date before placing it in their cart. Lisa was reading ingredient labels, looking for the most nutritious options within their budget. They moved through the store with the methodical precision of people who couldn't afford to make mistakes. At the checkout line, I saw Robert's hands tremble slightly as he pulled out the EBT card for the first time. The cashier was professional and efficient, processing the transaction without comment, but I could see the shame in my son's eyes as he handed over the card that marked him as someone who needed government assistance to feed his family. "The total is $43.72, the cashier announced, and Robert's benefits balance appeared on the small screen beside the register. As we loaded their groceries into my car, Lisa started crying quietly. "I never thought we'd be in this situation," she said. "I never thought we'd be the kind of people who needed food stamps." "What kind of people need food stamps?" I asked gently. She looked at me in surprise, as if the question had never occurred to her. "I don't know." Poor people. People who don't work hard enough or make bad decisions. People like you and Robert? The realization hit her visibly. We're not bad people. We just had some terrible luck. Most people who need assistance aren't bad people, I said. They're just people who found themselves in circumstances beyond their control. People who lost jobs, got sick, went through divorces, had family emergencies. People who discovered that the line between stability and crisis is much thinner than they ever imagined. That evening, Robert called me again. Mom, I owe you an apology. Actually, I owe you several apologies. You don't need to apologize. Robert. Yes, I do. We treated you terribly. We made assumptions about what you could and couldn't handle. We tried to make decisions about your life without respecting your right to choose for yourself. I was quiet, letting him work through the thoughts he needed to express. And we were wrong about people who need government assistance. I always thought it was a choice, or a sign of weakness, or lack of personal responsibility. I never understood that it could happen to anyone, that circumstances can change so quickly. What do you understand now? I asked. That dignity isn't about what you own or where you live or whether you need help. It's about how you treat people and how you let yourself be treated. And we didn't treat you with dignity. No, you didn't. I'm sorry, Mom. I'm truly sorry. It was the apology I had been waiting for, the acknowledgement that I had deserved, better treatment from my own family. But more than that, it was evidence that Robert had learned something important about empathy, about humility, about the difference between helping people and controlling them. 6 months later, Robert found steady employment with a smaller insurance company that was willing to overlook his previous termination. Lisa got a job as a receptionist at a medical office, work that was more stable and better suited to her skills than retail sales. They were able to move to a better apartment and gradually rebuild their financial stability. They never moved back to their old neighborhood or tried to recreate their previous lifestyle. The experience of losing everything had taught them to live more modestly, to save money for emergencies, to appreciate what they had, rather than constantly striving for more. Our relationship was different now, too. Robert and Lisa treated me with genuine respect, not the patronizing concern they had shown before. They asked for my advice on financial matters and listened to my opinions about their decisions. They invited me to dinner regularly, and Lisa always set the table with proper dishes, never paper plates. Most importantly, they never again suggested that I should change my living situation or make decisions based on their assessment of what was best for me. They had learned that independence and dignity were not luxuries to be discarded when they became inconvenient for other people. I continued living in my house on Magnolia Street, cooking Thanksgiving dinner on my good china, making my own choices about my money and my future. I never told Robert and Lisa about my role in engineering their financial collapse. They believed it had been a series of unfortunate coincidences, bad timing, and economic circumstances beyond anyone's control. In a way, that was true. Their downfall had been the result of poor financial planning, excessive debt, and the vulnerability that comes from living beyond your means. I had simply helped those natural consequences arrive more quickly and completely than they might have otherwise. The lesson I had taught them was not about revenge, but about respect, about understanding that every person, regardless of age or circumstances, deserves to be treated with dignity. About recognizing that needing help is not the same as being helpless, and that wisdom comes from experience, not from assumptions about what other people can handle. They had given me paper plates at Thanksgiving, treating my traditions and my home as disposable inconveniences. By Christmas, they were learning to be grateful for any plates at all, purchased with government assistance they had once looked down upon. It was exactly the education I had hoped they would receive, and I had been an excellent teacher. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.